Hello, bonjour,
Hi.
Ashidelek, and welcome to the third and final episode of the Canada-Tibet Committee Summer Speaker Series 2021. My name is Anvesh Jain, and I'm a current research associate with the Canada-Tibet Committee, hosting this discussion virtually from Calgary, Alberta. But you're not here for me. Joining us today is Jamyang Norbu, renowned Tibetan political activist, writer, and revolutionary. He is with us from the United States, but he has previously lived over 40 years as a Tibetan exile in India. Jamyang has a truly remarkable life story. He was born in Tibet and spent the first year and a half of his life there before his family relocated to India. As a teenager, he attended St. Joseph's School in Darjeeling, India, before running away as a 19-year-old to join Tibetan guerrilla group Chushi Gangdruk in order to combat the communist invasion. He was the creator of the Green Book Exile Taxation System, which has been funding the Central Tibetan Administration since the 1970s. Later, he founded and directed the Aminye Machen Institute at the Tibetan Center for Advanced Studies in Dharamshala, India. He has written several fiction and non-fiction books, including Buying the Dragon's Teeth, Warriors of Tibet, The Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, and Illusion and Reality, which is a collection of his political essays and missives. For many decades, Jamyang has been one of the true rock stars of the Tibetan universe, and we are so lucky to feature him on our speaker series today. Jamyangla, I hope you are keeping safe and healthy in these uncertain times.
Oh, I am. Thank you very much for asking.
Thank you sincerely for agreeing to feature today as the third and final guest of our Canada-Tibet Committee Summer Speaker Series. My first set of questions is regarding your writings and your activism. Where do you find the inspiration for your books and for your writings? And what kind of milieu does that arise from?
Well, essentially, it is not so much about inspiration. It's about dealing with the problems that Tibetan world faces from China. So essentially, I always have something to write about, something to get indignant about, something to dig up, some truth to dig up, and some truth to tell not only the world, but to the Tibetan people themselves, who oftentimes, they know the broad story, but a lot of the details are lost. I mean, I'm not blaming anyone. People are not, normal people are not expected to research everything. But I feel this is my job, and I'm a writer. So what I do with my research is essentially to bring out some kind of fiction or even an sociological or philosophical essay, but rather as a literary work rather than an academic work. So yeah, I've been doing that for a long time, and also trying to just look into Tibetan culture, civilization, and history, and try to inform the Tibetan public about many things that it is really in this day and time the people are not very aware of. How really rich the Tibetan civilization and culture was. Not only just the Buddhist aspects of it, because that's most people are aware of, but Tibetan people are not aware of the fact that, even the administrative work done by the Tibetan government in the old days, in spite of it being old-fashioned and, behind the times, there was a lot of aspects of it, especially in terms of environmental protection, even taking care of agriculture and crops, which is done not in a modern scientific kind of way, but traditional. But it served the purpose. It fed the people, it kept the environment, healthy, protected plants, it protected trees, and it protected the animals. And all these were done, if you do enough research on this, you'll realize that this is not just done because Tibetans are Buddhists and they love animals and all that kind of, rather emotional stuff, but it was done through legislation and ceremonies and actual kind of, even the building of certain monasteries in crucial areas where bird migrations took place, so that these birds could be fed. People could send reports to the central government. Because, we live in a world, unlike, let's say, other parts of, let's say, other civilizations, the world where it happened, generally these are in well sort of watered, fairly rich, temperate climate areas, in the Middle East, or even in India, maybe not now, but in the past, or in Europe, in England. These are green countries. But Tibet was living in a very marginal, Tibet is a marginal area in many ways. environmentally speaking. A lot of groundwater is lost. It's very high, it's very dry and arid. So people realized right from the start that you had to protect the environment, not because you're a Buddhist or you're nice, but purely to keep it going.
Yeah.
And so there were all these aspects of Tibetan world. And not only that, I'm not interested always in serious things like this, but I write about, let's say, crime in Tibet, in Lhasa. The Lhasa Ripper is a long essay I wrote, and because these things took place. That's why we had law courts, we had a police force. So I did a lot of writing on this. People liked it. So there, I do write serious stuff, but I also like to write stuff that's informative, but it amuses and, provides some kind of pleasure to my audience.
In that sense, do you find that your writing kind of functions as an act of resistance or even as a memorialization of this Tibetan way of life that you're trying to preserve?
It serves in both. It is resistance because I am trying to keep people from forgetting. And this is this is really the task of, in some way, the communist government in the People's Republic of China, is to make people forget. That is what all totalitarian governments are like. They want people to only be aware of their power, and their so-called legitimacy to that power, and make people forget history, make people forget that they had a life before this, that other things existed in this world beside that, person in power or that regime in power. So one of my way to make Tibetans, especially now Tibetans are forgetting quite fast, not only in, let's say, inside Tibet, but even in exile, that, Tibetans have become a kind of, there's they have a sort of a cult of victimhood now. Oh, the Chinese are bad to us, and and they carry on talking in that sort of way, while they forget actually that they had a great culture, they had a great language, they had a great imperial history, and it's important to remind people of it, not just to glory in the past, but to remind them that you do not have to accept, let's say, Chinese programs, that you do not have to accept Chinese oppression, that you can fight back, that you have had ancestors who did that. So in a way, it combines both. It serves also as a lesson, it serves people to help people not to forget. And of course, the main thing, it serves people to keep on resisting the communist oppression inside Tibet.
That actually reminds me of a quote by Milan Kundera. The struggle
Yes.
of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting.
I've used that in a quote in the first page of my book. So,
Okay.
Because that whole book is about memory,
Yes.
about Tibet and how the Tibetans fought against the Chinese. So it's a book that's be published in the end of this year.
Oh, okay.
So it's I think it's Penguin Random House.
Okay.
Come out with it in India. So
congratulations.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, thank you very much.
So following on from that, what inspires you in your activism work? How did you find the courage to run away at age 19 to join a guerrilla group? And how do you continue in the face of intense criticism, even sometimes from members of your own community?
Well, first thing, like when I was very young, I was not that really aware of Tibetan issue very much. When you're a schoolboy, to some extent, your life is caught up in that small routine of playing football and science and for me it was also like the first rock band in those days. When I was finishing school, it was around the mid '60s, so that was when the Beatles and things, Rolling Stones are happening, and everyone had to own a guitar. But then I was very fond always of reading. These Jesuit schools can be very lonely places, and the only thing that really sort of helps you to get over that is just the misery that you're encountering is to read escapist literature. But I read a lot of other things, but also I read Hemingway, and there are many faults with that writer, although he is a great writer. Nonetheless, he provided me with a kind of what could I say, a structure on which to think about my own life. So then suddenly it struck me, that the Chinese in Tibet, People's Liberation Army, was like Franco's, fascist troops. And the Kampa guerrillas were fighting were like, the partisans in the mountains that you had, and for whom the bell tolls. And I saw myself, of course, as the Gary Cooper figure, Jordan, the American volunteer who comes to help them. So it starts from such a rather kind of self-centered kind of position that you sort of see yourself in this, in a very, I was only about 15 when I had this, 16 when I was 17 when I left. So it's like, although yes, it is screwed up, undeniably, but it sort of got me to really think about the cause. And gradually, of course, I began to learn more about it, and finally I left home and joined the resistance, the guerrilla force in Mustang. So,
yeah.
And and also like the problem, like after I joined up, just a couple of years later, the Americans pulled out their support for the Tibetan resistance. So then, we had a lot of problems gradually. Like I was more involved later on with the, intelligence work, and that was needed also because I spoke English, I wrote English, although I just finished high school, and also I had some French, so from school. So I was used to, in Europe, I was looking for funding for the Tibetan resistance from, intelligence agencies in European countries. We tried the Russians at the time because China and Russia, that was the first time also they had the break. So the Russians weren't too interested with us. But, we had the French were interested. And so we managed to get some funding to keep it together. But, after a while, the whole thing fell apart. Primarily, there was no more funding. And, you cannot keep people in those sort of mountains where you really have no agriculture and, without money from outside. So then I had to find a way in which I could make myself useful. And what I read in those days in papers, this was like the late 60s, early 70s. Earlier Tibet had a very sort of sympathetic audience in the world, especially, just after the Korean War. China was seen in a very different light. It was seen in a rather hostile light all over Europe. And but after the 60s, from the 70s onward, Maoism took on a cachet, especially in the universities in the left, in the West, and with many Western kind of intellectuals and liberals. So there was the idea that Mao was actually, in some way delivering where Stalin and Lenin and all did it. That Mao was actually feeding the people. That he was this agrarian. He was not just some kind of communist intellectual, but he was a real agrarian hero. And things like that. And of course, it was rubbish. And basically, he was just a murderous thug. But that was the kind of thing that you had to fight against. And even like newspapers like The Guardian were very left in those days. They published stuff that's totally anti-Tibetan, even on Tibet and the road. And, not only The Guardian, like Le Monde, but even The Times, very often. Then they were all sucking up to China. And Mao was very popular in those days all over the world. Huh? So Little Red Book and things like this. So in those days, like in many universities also, of course, if you played the guitar, you would get the girls. But another way, if you didn't play, was to have Mao's thoughts on your desk, a Little Red Book or something like that. And chicks would think it's so cool. But that was the kind of world that I was in, and you had to fight that. And I tried by writing. But you realize soon that just because you went to an English-speaking school, it's not that simple. I wrote letters to the editor and stuff, and frankly, they were bad. And I only had a couple that published in time. But gradually, especially reading Orwell, because I got over my Hemingway phase, and another kind of volunteer to Spain during the Civil War. George Orwell. I was inspired by and his sort of volunteer is called Homage to Catalonia. And it's far more sophisticated than Hemingway, and far more knowledgeable about the reality, of the political problems in Spain at the time. So because of him, I began to have a more sort of deeper awareness about the politics of the left, and then also on writing, because Orwell, he has spelled out to writers very simple kind of advice how you can really write well. And gradually over time, I learned all by myself. I never went to university, but I just sat down and just started writing, and I improved to a point where people actually liked my stuff. So and I began to have some effect, not just because in those days, with print kind of journalism on Tibet, I just wrote maybe in some Indian papers, published my short stories and sometimes some kind of articles, but largely in the Tibetan Review, which was the premier kind of journal we had at the time. And I wrote practically every issue. I had an article going on, an essay rather, fairly long, but I worked on it usually for a month, very detailed. And over time, those began to have an impact on even on Dharamsala. That was when the Dalai Lama was first beginning. And he hoped that, when China, they had the liberalization project, when Deng Xiaoping came in, and they all realized that Maoism had been a disaster. And so they wanted to change and they had what they call the four modernizations. And, like the Tibetans were also very excited when they released prisoners and they asked the Dalai Lamas, some, his representatives to tour Tibet. So there was this incredible hope that China had really changed substantially and that it would keep on changing and would become, would join the what they call the community of nations and stuff like this. But I, at that time, because not only had I read, Orwell, but I had done a lot of reading on communist China. Now I had to do that as my intelligence was, it was very detailed. And you realize actually that the Chinese system, the communist system, the party system that they have is capable of, quite adroit maneuvering. But it is always limited, it cannot make radical changes. It can move from left, sometimes quite amazingly to the right. It can take one step backward in order to take two steps forward, as they put it. But it cannot really change fundamentally from a repressive totalitarian state to a democracy. And this is what I was trying to get across to His Holiness, to the Tibetan government, but the problem was that at that time, there was near universal sort of investment among people to believe in China, from the business community, from the academic community. And, I left myself open to attacks. It really, even the Tibetan Review, if you read my articles at that, you'll see so many letters to the editor from, not just from few Tibetans, but from Westerners who subscribed to this, people who are interested in Tibet, basically saying I was a CIA agent, trying to disrupt. Now something wonderful is happening in this world. China's now becoming a democracy. It's, we are all good. We want everything from hunky-dory and Tibetans be invited back to Tibet. And, someone like Jamyang Norbu is invested in this. And we know he went to Mustang. But, and after all, it's all this sort of thing that was happening. But in the Chinese themselves, actually, the first visitor to Tibet that they allowed was from Switzerland, the Tibetan. And he was invited to a big banquet. And, the Chinese official there really came out clearly and said, look, we are confident that the Dalai Lama is a wonderful person, that the Tibetans, are all wonderful people. But, you have people in your community like the Tibetan Youth Congress, and then this writer, Jamyang Norbu, who are trying to destroy the relationship of the great Chinese people and the great Tibetan people. But, in a sense, it's a compliment. It means my writing has had an impact, Nobody paid me for this. It comes out in the Tibetan Review, which is maybe had a circulation of 2,000 or 3,000, and the Chinese, they're reading it there. So it's like, I felt, hey, I'm making some difference. So yeah, over time, then I started taking this very seriously. I really worked at it, and this wasn't. After a while, I stopped venting. I wrote coolly, but I tried to also write as I didn't want to be a journalist. I saw myself as a writer, and I saw these essays, even though I wrote on political issues, as literature.
Yeah.
So they had to mean something, not just at that moment. I was not writing for that moment alone. I was writing in the context of deeper philosophical, deeper historical realities that people had to comprehend. So they have some staying power. And even though, to some extent, a lot of them have been self-published. They do sort of sell quite a lot. So yes, I'm prepared to still carry on. But the problem these days is people don't read that much. The reading world is getting very small, very fast, and it's even people who know how to, even university students cannot read those. As in the old days, I knew Tibetans who were not whose English was not very good, but who really took a dictionary and sat down and tried to understand what I had written, primarily because they needed it. They needed to know what was going on. And one guy even complained to me. He said, "Why do you throw in so much Latin, and French expressions?" So, but these days people don't. So I have to sort of, I'll keep on with my writing, but nonetheless, I figured I have to do more videos. I'm not very good with podcasts. And Tibetans somehow don't see, unless very young Tibetans seem to like podcasts, but I think overall YouTube is the way to go for Tibetans. And you can provide illustrations and things in the Tibetan language. So yeah, I have done a few. Maybe I'm thinking, like once I settle down, because I'm in New York, it's like we haven't settled out completely, and I need my library and everything with me. So yeah, I'm going to carry on in that direction. So yeah, I'm not finished yet. I've hit my 72nd birthday, but I'm going to carry on for a decade or two more. Yeah.
So we'll come back to China momentarily, but in the past, you've vehemently critiqued the Western image of Tibet as this kind of spiritual Shangri-La divorced from modernity and 21st century considerations. In some ways, you even argue that this Western gaze has placed pressure on Tibetans and Tibetan Buddhists in particular to conform to these Orientalist standards and expectations. So how do you see the ways that this Western gaze continues to manifest in current discourses surrounding Tibet?
Now, I think I've mentioned this before in another interview, that someone published recently. But I want to make it clear that I'm not, sort of just blaming people individually. This is a phenomenon, and it's not necessarily a Western one. The kind of, there is a special, but in the Western world, there is an idea that cultures of smaller countries, they can't take over India or China, but, like cultures like Tibet, there's a kind of sense of appropriation, like there's an idea that it's so wonderful that I need to prove myself in one way or the other. And there's also what's wrong with it in many ways. Of course, people can take interest in whatever they want. That's nothing. But, they, in a very subtle way, they distort it. They try to minimize the needs of the people themselves and try to tell them, maybe you don't need this. Maybe you should be doing this. And especially on Tibet, it's very sure that Tibetans should not be, struggling for their independence against China. There's always this idea in the West, especially with the liberal left, and it's always usually people from the liberal left who have the most interest in Tibet to begin with. But they don't like the aspect that Tibetans fought against communist China. That's somehow against Maoism. Like it rubs in the wrong places. But there also another thing is that the idea that Tibetans took sort of support from the CIA, the sin of all sins, And I've had tremendous arguments with people from the left. I said, look, in Spain, the left were taking, these revolutionaries were taking their support from Stalin and the Russian NKVD and the secret police and everything. So what's wrong with with the CIA? When you are in difficult positions like this, whoever helps you, I mean, of course they're exploiting you. Tibetans are not walking into this blind. They know these people are doing it for their own motivation. They're not doing it because they love us. But nonetheless, we're not looking for motives. When you're desperate and someone gives you guns when you need them, you're not going to. When the CIA offers you guns, when you especially need them, you're not going to refuse them. It would be foolish to do so. It would be foolhardy to do so. But there is this thing in the West. It's like the need to see Tibetans, and sometimes it gets irritating that they want to see Tibetans be even more Buddhist than Buddhists. Like they want the Buddha. They want Tibetans to be forgiving to China, to forget about what the Chinese did to the Tibetan people, and and start all over again. So there's this kind of idea that, especially they say, especially when China is becoming a democracy, and this was prevalent in the last couple of decades. Of course, it's changing now. People are realizing that this is not happening at all, that China is not easily becoming a democracy, especially the way they've crushed the democracy movement in Hong Kong, and how they're going after the democratic government in Taiwan. So, but nonetheless, it was there. And this is something where also, like all Tibet support groups really should rethink their strategy completely, because, it is totally stupid to think on those lines that China will somehow, become a democracy and that everything's going to be right. That we should keep on negotiating with the Chinese, although like all negotiations up to now have failed completely. And Chinese nonetheless, they always keep inviting Tibetans, but when Tibetans get there, they pull the rug out from under them. It's, I've written about this so many times that like I don't even bother now. It's like, Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown. And good old Charlie Brown, the Tibetans always keep, going running and to kick the ball and always falling flat on their back. So this is the problem that we have right now. And it's my hope that, and it's not only my hope, it is the kind of direction that I'm trying to provide to a few activists and groups that I know, that they should change the way they think about China. That not to, and especially to think about China not only as just a communist state, because there is no real communism at all at least in the philosophical sense, or in terms of, dialectical materialism. There's nothing of the sort, nothing there. Basically, it is a totalitarian system where you have a party and you have a boss, and that party basically, they use the kind of the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, essentially as a cover, but underneath it's a gangsters regime there to maintain power of the people who are members of that regime, and to take over more and more territory and power as time goes on. As it's been happening. It's not just in Hong Kong, but let's say even in South China Seas. They are going after those islands. They are quibbling with Japan over the Ryukyu Islands. They are quibbling with Russia also over the Sakhalin Islands. Maybe not in such a vehement way as they're doing it with other places, but there is that. It's not only India that has problems with China. It's Nepal has border problems. Korea has South Korea has border problems. North Korea has enormous problems.
Bhutan.
But then, and Bhutan, of course. So like you have basically, just expanding kind of a super imperialism that is coming from China, and nobody's prepared to really fight it. People are thinking in terms of maybe somehow kind of stopping them a little, but you have to fight it in some ways. Try to find, even if at the moment you do not have the solution, find a way to really stop it completely. And for me, the only way of really doing it is not to look even for democracy in China or for aspiring Democrats, because none exist. What we had, the last person we had in China was Liu Xiaobo, was heroic enough to come out. And in a mild way, he spoke up for the need for, the freedom of speech of the Chinese people. And he was locked up, and basically he had tuberculosis and died. It is the most cynical way of putting him away. And it's not even like, and nobody really dared to come out to support him in China. It's not like Russia, for all its crudeness and for all the kind of horrible things happening at Russia. When you have an activist leader coming out and Putin puts him in prison, you actually have half the town coming out demonstrating. They have a real parliament. We all know, of course, that a lot of the elections are rigged, this happens, that happens. But nonetheless, it is a parliament. In China, you don't have anything. You do not have a parliament. You do not have a parliament building. You have what they call the People's National Congress. And these are selected people. These are not directly elected by the common people. And they never say a word when they meet. They just read prepared speeches. And they meet actually in the Great Hall of the people in Beijing, which is a place where they entertain foreign guests. And they have, big shows. And last show that I know, they had river dance, the extravagant version out there. And that is where they meet. So it's totally cynical. And people should, I think, begin to understand that and, begin to take a more serious look at China. And I think especially people like you who are involved with Canada Tibet Committee, it's one of the earliest kind of real activist groups in the continent here, North America. And I really think, I feel, groups like this just concentrating solely on, trying to address human rights problems in Tibet, or appealing for the release of the Panchen Lama and things like, which should be done, absolutely. But just, cutting out everything else and doing this sort of thing is totally living in a total kind of illusionary world.
So regarding the state of the international Tibetan movement, as you briefly mentioned, the issue of Tibet seems to have metamorphosed from being recognized as a conflict between two independent nations to now being an issue of one ethnic minority group in China. So what do you think may have contributed to this global transition on the different stances on Tibet?
Well, what has contributed, I think, substantially to this is Tibetan government change in policy itself. When His Holiness and the Tibetan government actually hoped that by meeting with China, by negotiating with them, China would allow some measure of freedom inside Tibet, some measure of freedom to the people. And, I don't think it was wrong in any way to do that. But, they should have been more careful about how they worked on it, on every step of the way, they should have checked for Chinese reaction. And were they serious? Were they really going to do this? And I had given them many warnings in my writings, and also not just writings. I'm not someone who sits on the sideline. Actually, even meeting His Holiness, meeting the Tibetan cabinet a number of times. His Holiness, after one very sharp article I'd written about the failures of their kind of approach to China, His Holiness summoned me actually once. And, he gave me a real ticking off. I mean, of course, he has a right to do that, because, he is the leader of our community. And I had totally, publicly disagreed with him in a pretty strong way. And of course, he didn't just hurl abuse at me. No, he doesn't do that. But he tried to argue with me that I was wrong, and argued me very strongly. But I think this is where now we have to really change. People have to go back to the roots of all the problem. The root of the problem is that China invaded Tibet. And that's where all our problems started. And if people don't understand that Tibet before 1950, 1949/50, whatever its fault, was a viable society. People were being fed, people were leading, ordinary lives. Yes, it wasn't a democracy, it wasn't an ideal society, but people had enough to eat. There was law and order within the borders. uh, external to Tibet's borders. Whatever treaties we had with other countries, we observe it as best as possible. People are not running away from Tibet in droves. In point of fact, before 1950, there was not a single Tibetan who had migrated to Britain or to the United States at all. People are fairly happy in their own world. This is not to say that I am a fan of the old Tibet, that I think everything they did was wonderful. No, it was not. But it was a world in which you could live. You could lead a life. You could lead a life, like in your own way, be a farmer or a painter or artist or government functionary, what have you. And it was an interesting world. I find it fascinating. But that's by and by. But this is where I think people should understand that the problems that we have in Tibet are directly caused by the communist invasion. The only way it can be rectified is if Tibet is independent. There is no way, like in a regime like China, it has a kind of the logic that it has a totalitarian logic, which does not allow for any kind of expression, of opposition to it, or even criticism. And that people say, why can't the Chinese tolerate criticism? No, but it is logical. Because it is the sort of regime, once you build that sort of regime, like in a gang, in the mafia, why don't the mafia bosses tolerate what the underlings are saying? No, because once you've entered that sort of game, and you sort of begin to accept that, it is a sign of the whole system failing. It's not a democracy, which has inbuilt kind of system where you allow these things. When you have a regime like that, the only way in which you can change it is by overthrowing that regime. And in China's case, I'm not calling for anyone to go out with rifles and overthrow it, but we seriously ought to think not only of independence for Tibet, but independence for Hong Kong, independence for Taiwan, and even for Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. It is a huge stretch of territory. Size of at least 2 or 3 European countries there, and even in China, in Sichuan province, in Guangdong province. Sichuan actually, after the Chinese Revolution in 1912, they wrote their own constitution, where they had actually, one of the articles was that, the Sichuan legislature came up with this, that they would be allowed to secede from China if the Chinese government did not observe, democratic mores. So it has happened before. Guangdong province. We have had problems with language, not only for Tibetans, but for in the the Uyghurs and also the Hui, in Xining and all these areas. They've had problems with speaking Arabic or with their religion. But now in Guangdong, which is a very large province, just speaking the Cantonese dialect. The Chinese are trying to stop. They tried to stop Cantonese TV. They were insisting that the Cantonese now listen to Beijing TV, like have the Beijing dialect be spoken. And Cantonese is a very rich, extremely interesting culture and linguistic culture on its own. Why shouldn't they sort of be able to sort of practice their own culture in their own way? And this is where I feel, like, if we just keep, nitpicking on these, nothing is going to happen. People have to realize that huge state, the only way in which people are going to have democracy in their places, when there are smaller entities, when you do not have that central power, basically, in a way, destroying whatever efforts are being made by people to democratize. In the Soviet Union, in some ways, why do you have still some parts of the Soviet Union democratic? It's because the whole place split up. Like even like the little democracy, the election that you have now, as sort of in some ways wrong as they are in Russia itself, even that modicum of democracy that they have came about because of the split of the Soviet Union. But the China has never split. The Chinese empire has never split. And I think it is really a serious time. Seriously, people have to start thinking on those lines. and talking and debating on these lines. And maybe interesting, I think the Chinese people, whatever it is, whatever they say now, are not happy with the system. But it is a kind of system where they cannot express themselves at all. So I think even the nationalism that you get, the knee-jerk nationalism that you get from young Chinese in China, is a very, very shallow one. I don't expect any real opposition. If one has a really good intellectual argument against the system.
So moving on, you're a firm believer in secular democracy and have written in the past about the tensions between the monastic and secular institutions in the Tibetan polity, especially as you mentioned in Old Tibet. So in your opinion, what should the post-Dalai Lama Tibetan state resemble or look like, and how would that inform Tibetan advocacy moving forwards?
I think it should be in every way a democracy, without any qualifications. If there is the institution of the Dalai Lama survives to then, it can be more something on the lines of, let's say, the British monarchy, or maybe the Thai monarchy. But of course, I shouldn't say the Thai monarchy, because that's other kind of oppressive. That's it. The British monarchy is about, I think, the safest thing that we can have. Although, like, even without the Dalai, because one thing we all have to realize is that, the Dalai Lama is not a pope that, like many journalists tend to write about the Pope of the Tibetan Buddhism. He is the fifth Dalai Lama who actually sort of started the whole institution in Tibet. He was basically a politician who created the Ganden Potang government and used the Kosher Mongols to reconquer large tracts of old Tibet and to form Tibet again. So, he was a tough cookie. He was an extremely astute politician. But the thing is, all things coming to an end, I do not see why we should actually have a Dalai Lama. I do not think also, like with the institution of lamas, they have served their purpose. I am not going to say anything negative about it. But I do not think it's necessary at all in Tibetan kind of belief system. Traditional Buddhists have never had reincarnation. We don't have a reincarnation of the Buddha. So, if the Buddha is not there, why should I want someone else? So I think these are like, in some ways, Tibetan Buddhism has been very creative sometimes, because of the needs of its own history, and it has, evolved these institutions and has served, at the time, at the place, especially with the Mongols, these institutions have served the people well. But maybe it's now time for Tibetans to move on away from these. Not to say that they shouldn't be Buddhists at all, but to move away from these institutions, or at least put them, on the back burners, and to carry on, like, especially with the dynamism of Tibetan Buddhism, be more creative, find other ways of doing it, because Tibetan Buddhism has been very creative, and so I don't think that creativity should just stop with the question of Tibetan incarnation lamas. Maybe there could be other ways of doing these things. So within the kind of Buddhist philosophical kind of framework, which we, of course, I think Tibetans will continue to, hold and treasure. So I think there are other ways of doing it. And I am not someone who's going to say, this is wonderful, you should do it. But I do believe that Buddhism, especially the Buddhism that the Tibetans evolved inside Tibet, is very creative and dynamic. It is one of the most, other Buddhists have their, positive points, but Tibetan Buddhism has its creativity, not only in art, but, in its political institutions. And I think these could certainly change in a way more befitting, not just our present time, but even future.
Thank you. That's certainly an interesting perspective. And unfortunately, we don't have that much time, so I'm going to have to ask one last question. And that's going to be, what areas should supporters of Tibet be paying attention to nowadays? And in your estimation, how can we all be better advocates of the Tibetan cause moving forward?
One area that people should really, I think all supporters of Tibet must pay attention is to the fact that Tibet was an independent country, and we should make that better known to the world. People are not aware of it. Tibet is always just a human rights problem. Or maybe the Dalai Lama, if he goes back, everything's going to be wonderful. That this was a separate, not only a nation state, a legitimate nation state. Before that, even a separate empire, that existed side by side with the Tang dynasty. So when you have this argument can be given to people, and in some ways for us to publicize to the world that this is an absolutely independent country that was invaded by the Chinese so-called People's Liberation Army in 1950. This is what the first invasion of military invasion of a country following World War II. Even like, let's say, North Korea invading South Korea wasn't the invasion of one nation by the other. This was basically one nation that had been divided for political purposes, for Cold War reasons. Tibet was not that. It was clearly an independent nation. It appealed to the United Nations a number of times. It held off the Chinese after the Chinese, wiped out the first Tibetan force in Chamdo. It still resisted for 5 long months, sending delegations to the United Nations, continuing to appeal till about 5 or 6 months later. Then it finally had to deal with the Chinese. So this is something that I think is really important to get out to the world. And the history of it is very interesting. So it's not just boring reading. And one reason I think it's so important is that, His Holiness told me, the last time I met him was, I think, a couple of years ago. And he called me, and he really, this time he didn't have anything negative to say. He just said he was very glad to see me, and he wanted to say a few things. He said, "Look, we don't agree on the question of negotiation with China. I know you are pro-independence, and I am, I feel that can be given up. But," he said, "I want you to understand one thing, that it is really important for you to keep up your activism to show the world that Tibet was an independent country once upon a time." And he said, "It's important because if I want to negotiate with the Chinese, I have to be able to make the Chinese and the world realize that Tibet was an independent country. If it wasn't an independent country, why should the Chinese begin to negotiate with me at all? If it was just another province of China, why should the world take any notice of what the Chinese are doing to it?" So he said, that's why it's so important for you to keep up the whole question. He said he felt it was really important to the middle way, his philosophy, that the Tibetans, I and my comrades, and even, of course, I'm thinking by extension to all you activists for Tibet, to be able to demonstrate to the world and also to people in power that we are not, tell them that human rights is important, but this goes much deeper, that we have to be able to tell China that Tibet was an independent country. We have to be able to inform all people in the world. And I'm beginning to work on a series of ways on which to do it. And I hope that the Canada Tibet Committee and all other kind of support groups in, especially like foreign supporters of Tibet, pick up on this and support me.
Yes, and might I add that at the time of the Chinese invasion of Tibet, the Canadian Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson, he wrote in an internal memo that they were confident that Tibet was qualified for independent statehood at that time in 1950. So
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So anyways,
especially like, I think you look at a lot of the nation state that came into being, after the Tibetan fiasco, like from Africa and Asia. A lot of these were like decolonized areas, which are some of them, especially in Africa, were not nations before that. That doesn't mean they're not entitled to be independent, but these were like tribal groups that had in some ways been formulated into colonies by the colonial powers, by the Belgians, the French, and the British. And, when they gave them independence also, there was no real sort of ethnic grouping or grouping along kind of, racial or, even political lines. It was done so arbitrarily, so that's why you still have all the problems that you have there. But Tibet was not. This was not only an independent nation, but it also had, the leader at the time, the young Dalai Lama, was a popular leader. This was not even like Vietnam or something, with unpopular leaders. It was totally viable at that time in the world. But because of, let's say, British cynicism, because Britain was the first country to sell out Tibet, and that everyone went after Britain's kind of advice on this because they were the countries that had dealings with Tibet. But Britain, I can't prove this, but essentially the Tibetan officials believed at the time that because of Hong Kong, because one of the threats was not just to liberate Taiwan, to liberate Tibet, which the Chinese said in 1949, but also to liberate Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was the worst of the lot because, that was taken from the Chinese because of unfair treaties by, Western powers. Why didn't the Chinese, they had even prepared evacuation sort of procedures to take the British administration, British, people living in Hong Kong to Australia. But then one fine day, nothing happened. And, a quid pro quo, they said a secret one might have been reached. This is what Tibetan officials in the past believed, I cannot prove it, but maybe, these days, because of, freedom of, Information Act in Britain, we might discover one thing or the other. Okay, so then, yeah, I hope that was good enough for you guys.
That was perfect. Thank you, Jamyang. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a remarkable conversation on your lifetime of Tibet advocacy and your thoughts regarding the past and future of the global Tibetan movement. I wish you all the very best, and I look forward to your future appearances for us here at the Canada Tibet Committee, and good luck on your book as well with the Penguin Random House.
Thank you very much, and I hope to meet you in the near future, especially after I've finished my book. I can do a book tour in Canada and meet up with you guys.
That would be fantastic.
Okay.
And for our amazing viewers, thank you for following along with the Canada Tibet Committee Summer Speakers Series 2021. It's been my utmost pleasure being your host this summer, and I'm grateful to all who tuned in throughout the series. Thanks once again. Be sure to follow us on our social media channels for more interviews, media releases, and reporting on all things Canada and Tibet. This is Anvesh Jain, signing off on behalf of the Canada Tibet Committee. Tukjiche and Bodh Gyalo.
Gyalo.